Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
Hello, I'm James Monk. I'm a researcher here at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I'm joined by ASPI's Executive Director, Peter Jennings. Peter, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you, James.
Peter, we've learned that the US Navy, at the direction of President Donald Trump, has launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at a Syrian airbase near Homs, destroying runways, hangars, fuel facilities, and ammunition stores. The Americans have stated that the strike was retaliation for a chemical weapon attack by the Assad regime earlier in the week. Now, was this an appropriate response, a proportional response? And do you think this will deter future use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime?
Well, maybe let's take each of those three elements in turn. Was it an appropriate response? Yes, I think it was, because I think there is a very strong interest that the international community should be prepared to enforce against the use of chemical weapons. And in some ways, I think it was actually, this was the strike that the Obama administration should have considered in September of 2013, after the Assad regime had actually continued to use, or had used chemical weapons at a time when the president had said don't do it. So appropriate, yes. Proportionate response. Well, 56 cruise missiles, that's a very heavy strike, and it is clearly designed to not just damage, but to essentially take down that airbase and the aircraft on it as being a future capability. And I suppose that's partly my view about how military force should work, which is to say, be reluctant to use it, but when you decide to use it, do it in a way that's decisive. And I think that's a very clear signal that the Americans have intended to send. Thirdly, will it stop the Syrians from using chemical weapons in the future? I hope it does, because I think if there is any future attempt to literally take off with aircraft or helicopters that may be carrying chemical weapons, I think the Americans will strike those aircraft down as well. So really what the Assad regime is being told is that's the end of it, no more.
I see. Now, Prime Minister Turnbull was briefed in advance about the impending strike, making him one of only a handful of world leaders who knew about the strike in advance. The Prime Minister, Defence Minister, and Opposition Leader have all expressed broad support for the US actions. As events unfold over the coming days and weeks, what is the potential for Australian involvement in future operations against the Assad regime?
Well, James, I'd say that the early notice of the strike is exactly the sort of thing you would want to have between close allies. So I'm pleased that happened, because that says to me that the alliance relationship was acting as normal. I think it's going to be a much harder question for Malcolm Turnbull, though, to decide, are we now going to change our strategy, which in Syria has really been limited to attacking so-called Islamic State targets. Are we now going to think about broadening the strategy into perhaps shutting down the Syrian Air Force, or something that's more directly targeted against the Syrian regime? And watching Malcolm Turnbull's press conference today, I got the sense that he was looking pretty uncomfortable about exactly that question. He has made it clear that he doesn't see right now a change, but I think we've also got to be sort of acknowledge the reality that this is now a rapidly evolving situation. So what is sensible as of Friday afternoon, which is where we're at now, may be no longer appropriate this time next week. I think our government is going to have to be open to being pretty flexible about where we take our strategy next. And the key driver of that, of course, will be what the US is doing, because they will always be the country which is bringing the bulk of the military force to the theatre.
Russian President Vladimir Putin also appears to have been informed ahead of the strike, and there may have been Russian personnel operating on the base during the strike. President Putin has invested a great deal of political and economic capital in propping up the Assad regime. Do you think there may be some kind of Russian response to the US strike? And what form might such a response take, whether in Syria or elsewhere?
It's really hard to know. Firstly, it's not clear who in the Russian hierarchy knew what and when, if I can put it that way. I think the first thing that happened is that there's a sort of a tactical network that the Russians and the Americans are using to talk to each other about aircraft movements in Syria, which is all designed to make sure that they don't shoot one another down. And I think that was probably the main communications channel. So you can imagine a situation which would basically say to the Russians, we're advising you to have all of your aircraft out of this piece of airspace in the next 30 minutes. Mm. That may well be all the Russians got. Whether or not there was communication to Putin, I think we won't know for some time. Then the question is, okay, so what are the Russians going to do from here? I think a couple of things. Firstly, they will realise, if they didn't know it already, that they've got a very different president to deal with than Barack Obama. Trump is now has demonstrated twice he's prepared to use armed force. That makes him a different kind of person to have to deal with. Secondly, I think the Russians will be saying to themselves, they'll be asking themselves the question, has Bashar al-Assad lost his value to us? Because he's the guy ultimately responsible for the chemical weapons attack. And I think there'll be, a discussion in the Kremlin around, is it time to cut Assad loose and we'll promote a minister or a general from the Syrian regime who we at least can say was not responsible for the chemical weapons attack. And then the third thing will be, of course, Putin's compulsion not to look weak. So he's been presented here with a challenge, and if you look at how Putin has dealt with that in the past, he's never shied away from using shows of Russian military force to say we also need to be we also have to be taken into account. And so I think we'll see some show of Russian military force in Syria, which will be designed to say, look, we're still in control here, America, so don't get too carried away with what you've just done.
And what about in Europe? There's some level of strategic competition between Western powers and Russia in Europe, particularly around, say, the Balkans or Eastern Ukraine.
Yes, I think it's quite likely that something might happen there. It doesn't need to happen in the Syrian theatre. And so you could say, well, what are the things we've seen in the past? We've seen incredibly aggressive Russian fly-pasts of American warships, pretty much at sort of radar height. We've seen aggressive Russian military exercising along the borders with the Baltic states. I reckon we'll see more of that, which is all about sort of a muscle flexing on the part of the Kremlin to just remind the US that, well, you may be able to destroy a Syrian airfield, but don't think we're in that category. We have to be taken more seriously.
Now, these events are taking place during another significant occasion, which is the meeting between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Do you think there's any significance in the timing, given the recent rhetoric surrounding North Korea?
I think the timing is largely coincidental, because I think what we're seeing in Syria was a response to the chemical attack of 48 hours ago. Look, I must say I'm not known for being overly sympathetic to the Chinese leadership, but I do feel a pang of sympathy for President Xi, because he's landed at probably the worst time for a Chinese leader to be talking to the American president. And I say that for a couple of reasons, James. I think firstly, almost anything that was on the agenda has now been been relegated to second place in terms of the international attention being directed towards the American strike. Secondly, I think it does create a challenge for President Xi, which is am I now going to stand up to do a joint press conference with the president, which would be, typically what you might see toward perhaps the end of the summit. I think it will be hard for Xi to do that. And so what we might see is the summit being closed earlier with a fairly bland statement issued that will really tell you that the Chinese and the Americans have not been able to come to grips with the issues that they wanted to talk about. And then the third thing is maybe even the most interesting of all, which is North Korea. And there I think, the Americans won't be unhappy about sending a signal to China to say, well, look how tough we were with the Syrians. So you China, you better believe us when we say to you that we can be just as tough with those North Koreans. And remember, if you're not prepared to actually help us, China, as the president said in an interview with the Financial Times, if China won't help us on North Korea, well then we'll fix the problem ourselves. So I think by not necessarily by timing, but by design, the Americans will want China to read this as a statement of how strong they're prepared to be in a military sense when it comes to dealing with North Korea.
Peter, what do you think the domestic implications of this might be for Donald Trump's presidency?
All politics is domestic politics, and I have no doubt, given what we know of Donald Trump to date, that he'll be looking at the opinion polls that will inevitably happen as a result of this strike. And generally speaking, what happens with opinion polls in America after the US has engaged in military action is that they go up in terms of support for the president. So I think he will conclude that the use of strong, muscular military action is something that's good for him domestically. And there is a risk that that will lead to him thinking, well, if I do more of it, is that going to help me domestically? Therefore, I think the real danger here is that without carefully thinking through what America's next steps might be, they could find themselves on a spiral towards further military action in Syria, which may not come off as successfully as what they've just done in the last few hours. One has to say that none of this brings us closer to a solution to the civil war in Syria, and no country has a strategy really to deal with it. So we just have to keep watching carefully to see what is evolving on the ground.
Thanks so much, Peter.
James, thank you.